This happened about 20 years ago, when I was 9 years old. My parents told me about it on various occasions, so I thought it would be helpful to share their version of the story. My parents are biologists who met at work. They both worked in a government building dedicated to biological research. The building was used for government projects aimed at benefiting the public by studying the environment and passing environmental protection laws based on research. There was always a security guard at the old government building who worked day and night. During the day, he mostly stood at the reception desk greeting people. At night, he made rounds to ensure no one entered the building where scientific equipment and computers were kept. Initially, the guard seemed like a nice person. He was always very nice to me, and to be honest, I had only good memories of him before that. He greeted me and spoke to me in a very friendly way. Every time my parents took me to work, he would make paper airplanes for me. He was amazingly good at making them and playing with them. He would also stay with me at the reception when my parents needed to work at night, probably because of me. It got very boring very quickly, so he kept me company and mainly entertained me. We talked, played with paper planes, and watched TV. All of it seemed sweet enough for my parents to entrust me to him, which was probably their biggest mistake. One day, my parents had to work even later than usual. I think it was about 10 p.m. and they were still working. So, a guy who worked the night shift decided to bring me with him to the building for his rounds. We started at the top floor, checking all the rooms on the roof. Each room. It was so dark that I was always a little behind and had to wait for the lights to turn on. Then we went down to the second floor, where our parents' office and laboratory were located. We checked the opposite side of the building, entering the lab with huge extractors, microscopes, and all the scientific equipment that you might think of. We then went downstairs to the first floor where most of the administrative offices are located. I still remember seeing some maps on the walls and embalming fish that served as decorations. The first floor was completely cleared out, so it was time for us to check it out. We thought it might make sense to start checking the labs on our right side first, since there was a set of stairs at the end that led to where our parents were. For some reason, though, we decided to check that side instead. Initially, we checked every test, but I noticed his pace had increased and he was moving much faster. As we started to look around, we noticed that he seemed happier and more excited. We checked the labs again, from one corner to another, turning the lights on and off as we went. When we reached the last area, he turned all the lights inside the lab on. Inside, there were 3 officers on either side of the lab. He hurried to the printer, opened it, and pulled out 2 sheets of paper. Quickly, he folded them into planes. And then things changed. He picked one of the planes and flew it outside, throwing it across the room. He said it was my plane and we could play with it. I ran over to get mine, feeling happy that we were going to play. But suddenly the lights went off. When I looked around, he had already left the lab, turned off the lights, and locked the door behind him. I tried to follow him, but it was too late. The door was punched and kicked, with shouts for him to open it. Panic possessed me because of how scared I was in the dark. Through the glass, I could see him running down the hallway, turning off lights as he went, disappearing around a corner. I was sure that was all I saw, every shadow, every creepy monster, because I was terrified. While I waited, it was all part of my imagination because I was so frightened. I pressed myself against the wall and watched shadows move in the darkness, crying, not understanding what was happening or why he did it. Eventually, my parents finished work and picked me up, taking me home. The security guard was waiting at the front desk when we arrived, but I wasn't there. They were obviously panicked and must have shouted 100 swear words at him. I do not know how my father did it. They didn't kill him right then and there, but when they first asked him where I was and what he had done to me, he just said that he had gone out with me for rounds and must have lost his way somewhere in the building while checking everything from top to bottom. It would have taken about an hour and a half, even if you were in a hurry, so he must have got lost. They searched for hours, but didn't find him, and it was only when I saw a light at the end of a corridor leading to a lab that I found the courage to stand up, run towards the door, and bang on it as hard as possible. Finally, they found him there and forced a guard to open the door so they could get him out. I can't remember whether I slept that night or not, but if I did, I probably did because I was exhausted. My mother stayed with me in the bedroom all night, of course. Of course, my parents filed a complaint later that evening against the guard. When they did so, an investigation began. He was actually fired and arrested, not because he locked me up, where he probably helped me so that no one would find me, but because he was in cahoots with criminals to steal computers and equipment from the building in order to sell them on a shady market, along with information and hard drives, and make money from it. By that time, he had stolen a lot of old computers, and no one had figured it out. Who knows what his plans were? That night, locking a crying child in the middle of the dark hidden in some room is not normal behavior unless you're trying to hide them and pick them up later when everyone else is gone and sell them as part of your product. Fortunately, he didn't have the opportunity to do so, and I hope he never does this to another child. 3 years ago, I was a waitress when COVID hit the world. It was my first job, and I remember looking forward to starting work as soon as all my studies were completed and I received my certificates. Every evening we closed at 10 p.m., and there was usually just me and a 20-year-old chef. I rarely saw other waitresses, and I liked that. I always worked alone and didn't really get along with the other waitresses. So, it was actually nice. Towards the end of my time there, something happened. I was glad I had those circumstances at that time, but I felt anxious and couldn't decide if my feelings were valid. I mentioned this to my manager, because when it all happened, it felt real and like I had started something new. That evening, I finished work around 3 p.m. I said goodbye to the last waitress and left. I was left alone with my chef, and everything was going fairly slowly and normally until I received a call regarding one of the special dishes on the limited time menu. Food could not be removed, and the lady at the other end of the line did not take it well. After some discussion, she finally decided to sit down and eat. I estimated that it would take about 10 to 20 minutes. While I was waiting, an old car pulled up and 3 people got out. 2 men and a woman in their 30s or 40s. It was the woman with whom I had been speaking on the phone, whom I confirmed when I asked. She seemed embarrassed and petulant at first, but her attitude changed later when she saw me, becoming much more friendly and cooperative. Because that was what most people wanted, to look good in the eyes of others, I sat them down at a table and took their orders. I noticed that they had a red folder and a black pen. Do you remember that? While I was serving other customers, there were several more tables waiting for me to bring their food. They inquired if I knew anyone who could assist them in finding a residence in the area. I found this to be a reasonable inquiry, as the region was well known for attracting tourists, and individuals frequently sought vacation homes. I acknowledged the validity of their inquiry, but if they were not unpleasant, I would not have any objections. If you understand what I mean, I provided them with the contact information of a real estate agent with whom I was well acquainted. I often attended church services with her, and there were no other noteworthy individuals, so I did not engage with them beyond serving them drinks. It was 4:30 p.m., and they were the last of my customers. In the world of catering, you are aware of the hectic nature of waiters' work. There are few breaks, and sometimes none at all when things are busy. We were also busy, so my cook and I took a well-deserved rest. I went out and engaged in conversation with them for a while. Before entering the restaurant, there was a ramp leading to the entrance for individuals with disabilities. The ramp was quite long, as the building had a raised foundation. At the time, I did not notice this, but a man caught my attention from the other end of the ramp by engaging in conversation with me. I was standing at the top of the platform where the ramp ended, with a railing. The man and woman were about 5 feet below me on the other side of the railing. We talked for a bit, and they asked personal questions such as where I lived and whether I smoked marijuana. I realized that sharing such personal information with strangers was not advisable, but I answered their questions as vaguely as possible. They persisted, so I was unable to escape their presence. I attempted to maintain a professional distance from them outside of work, but they persisted in their attempts to contact me. Eventually, I realized that they would not relent, so I decided to listen to what they had to say. The woman finally got to the point and revealed that she had a business proposition for me. She owned a cleaning company called Pretty Kitties and sought to hire attractive young women for her team. She already had 10 girls working for her and wanted to expand. The girls were paid a monthly salary of $30,000. She did not specify the duration of the job or the required qualifications, but it sounded like a promising opportunity. At that moment, I knew this was not a legitimate business, so I declined their offer courteously and terminated the conversation. I politely declined her offer, explaining that I was content with my current employment and supervisor. She attempted to convince me further, emphasizing the ease of the task and the potential financial gain under her guidance. When she mentioned having a van for her business, I was unsure of the exact meaning, but I recalled her asking me to follow her to her car. She stated that she would show me a picture of her van on her phone, which she was holding, so I knew I would not be approaching her vehicle. I declined, stating that I was content where I was, and suggested she show me the image on her phone. After a moment of hesitation, she concluded the conversation and departed with 2 other men. I returned to the restaurant, shaken, and explained the situation to my chef, who joked that if I had accepted, I would have made a substantial profit. As seriously as I should have, I would have laughed at the end of that encounter. On the night when Cook's grandmother arrived to pick us up, I mentioned the peculiar interaction, and her face showed a hint of panic. She sat there, staring at me, and I was perplexed. I inquired if everything was all right, and that's when she revealed to me the signs of human trafficking. She explained that I had almost been sold, and I was incredibly fortunate not to have been abducted. My stomach tightened, and I began to panic, realizing the danger I had been in. After that, nothing else happened, except for the red folder and black pen I mentioned. The next day, I went to work, and a customer came in. Usually, there aren't many people in my area who like to relax, but this customer was different. He was well dressed and sat at my table, not in a suit or tie, but dressed nicely. I was attending to a customer who was impeccably dressed. He was alone, so I escorted him to a booth and took his order for a cup of coffee. There was a red pen with a black badge attached to it, which I only noticed after my colleague reminded me about it last night. I was taken aback by this revelation and even more dismayed that the customer had been waiting for 3 hours while I was busy with other tables. I kept asking him if he needed anything else, but he inquired why people never take a moment to relax over a cup of coffee. I shrugged and replied, "No, not here." This may come as a surprise, but waiters are not eavesdroppers. I am fortunate that I managed to handle the situation without any issues. One thing that stood out in my memory was when he was discussing financial matters on the phone, expressing the need to find alternative living arrangements. He also mentioned transferring funds and paying bills that evening, prompting me to rush to the back of the kitchen to inform my colleague. Fortunately, he came to assist me with the task of delivering some plates. I was delighted, but he soon departed. Since then, I have not seen or heard from him. I must admit, I am now more cautious. In 2013, I was seeking an internship to further my studies, but it proved to be unattainable. Therefore, while I was searching for an internship, I decided to take a job to secure a source of income. A friend of my fiancé's operated a taxi service for individuals with disabilities and required someone to work during the night, as the buses were in operation for 22 hours a day. As an owl, I immediately accepted the offer. I was hired to perform a task that required me to provide necessary assistance. The task involved picking up individuals and transporting them to their desired destinations. Occasionally, I had to use a vehicle to lift or lower wheelchairs up or down stairs. When there were no scheduled trips, I would go to a designated location and wait. During this time, I could engage in any activity I desired. I swiftly located a truck stop in the vicinity, where I could park my vehicle and rest. In the early hours of my shift, I purchased a cup of coffee at a gas station. Across the street from the gas station was a dilapidated restaurant with a motel attached. It was ideal for truck drivers seeking a place to sleep. If I arrived in the middle of the night, I would park next to the restaurant and spend the night there. I observed that many people were coming and going to a specific room. Initially, I paid little attention to the incident. However, one night at the end of summer, as I was dozing off with the windows open, I suddenly heard shouts coming from the motel. A man emerged from a room and fled, and a few moments later, another man pursued him. I couldn't discern what he was holding. At first, it was none of my concern, so I returned to my half-asleep state. Shortly after, my phone rang. I was on a trip an hour away, so I answered the call and drove out of the parking lot. When I spotted the other man around the corner, I reversed my journey for the rest of that night and didn't return home until the following morning at 2 or 3 a.m. When I arrived at the parking lot, which is where I usually park, I noticed that the area was littered with rocks. Without making any assumptions, I parked a few spaces away. I waited and waited. I fell asleep quickly, but was awakened by the sound of a car passing in front of my bus. The car honked its horn, turned on its high beams, and started its engine. I thought the driver was just a jerk who noticed me sleeping and wanted to scare me. I jumped off the bus and yelled at the driver to leave me alone, but instead, he stopped the bus and forced me to start braking. The driver gestured for me to leave, and I realized I had been foolish. I stood there, staring at the car, even though I couldn't see clearly with the high beams on. After what seemed like an eternity, the car drove off, and I parked next to some trucks. A month has passed since that incident with the car, and nothing has happened since. It would have happened again if I hadn't parked near the trucks that night. One night, I worked a 12-hour shift for 6 hours. It was 6 o'clock in the morning, and I hadn't had time to eat before going to work that day. During the first part of my shift, I was busy making deliveries and didn't have time for a meal. When I received a message to return to the base, I quickly parked at the far end of an almost empty parking lot. I picked up the truck and prepared to have my very late dinner that my fiancée had packed for me. I wanted to watch TV while eating on my phone, so I sat with my back against the driver's door. Behind me, with my back to the door, I accidentally hit the lock with my elbow. Luckily, I was scrolling through Netflix when I heard the lock click. Turning around quickly, I saw a hooded man crouching on the ground under the bus, holding a large kitchen knife. His right hand. I quickly rose to my feet and made sure that the remaining 2 doors were secure. Then I peered inside to check if they were still there. I scanned the surroundings in all directions to confirm their presence, but he was still under the bus. I knew I wouldn't jump out this time because the knife had made his intentions clear. I started the engine and turned on the interior light. Then, I looked around to see if he would be scared. Fortunately, he was. I saw him running away and disappearing into the bushes at the end of the parking lot. After that night, I never parked at that parking lot again. Whenever I do park, I always check twice to make sure all the doors are locked.